Hello everyone, welcome to Pregnancy and Birth Diaries. Today I want to talk to you about something that I have been wondering myself for a very long time. I wanted to know why we women decide to have a child after the horrors of the first childbirth. Now, obviously, there are women who never ever decide to have children after, having physical and mental trauma after their first childbirth. But I have a feeling that for most of us, we want to have kids, and we decide to have our second, third, or fourth, and fifth children after going through terrible pain. It just feels like it's so against our survival instincts. And I always wanted to know why. I knew that there should be some science behind it, because it just does not make sense. If you're, for example, beaten, you don't want to be beaten ever again. If you have gone through some horrible mental trauma, you don't want that again. You just do not want unpleasant, painful experience again. It's just this is not how our brain works. But when it comes to childbirth, it doesn't work like that anymore. When it comes to childbirth, we want to go through that painful experience over and over again. And I wanted to know what's the science behind it. But I was lazy and I wanted to do a video about it, but I thought, okay, maybe later, and I was just putting it off. And then the other day I was just having tea and I decided, okay, I have like 15-20 minutes. I'm just gonna pick a book randomly and just read something. And you won't believe it, I just picked randomly Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari, and opened any page, just randomly opened the page, and I started reading. And like the next page there was an answer to my question, which was so weird because it was such a coincidence. And I actually found an answer to my question reading this book for, 10 minutes. And it was so random, coincidence or not, I don't know. But yeah, so here is the answer. And I want to start with one example. So here he brings sort of like a study, and it's about a boy who had an epilepsy. So epilepsy patients, when they, in epilepsy, every attack, there are waves. There's like a storm in the brain, and in order, sort of the storm that begins in one hemisphere does not move on to the next hemisphere, they cut the connector between two hemispheres, and they're called, I think, brain split patients. And that way, storms that start in one hemisphere do not move on to the next one. So they conducted studies on brain split patients, and they asked a teenage boy who he wanted to become when he grows up. And his left hemisphere, which is responsible for speech, answered that he wants to become a draughtsman. So he heard the question and he answered, and his answer was a draughtsman. But now they wanted to know what his right hemisphere would answer to the same question. But instead of asking, they put the question in writing and made it visible to his left side. So I'm just going to read this from the book. They quote, "They placed the paper at the edge of the boy's left visual field. Data from the left visual field is processed in the right hemisphere. Since the right hemisphere could not use vocal language, the boy said nothing, but his left hand began moving rapidly across the table, collecting tiles from here and there until it spelled out automobile race. Spooky." End quote. So there is a left and right hemisphere, and they want different things. That's what we learned. Now, there is also another, there are a few more studies given in this book, but I'm just gonna summarize them and give you a sort of like a shortcut to it. Now, we have two different selves. Let's say there is an experienced self and there is a narrating self. An experienced self is obviously our self that experience certain events that happens to us. And narrating self is something that narrates whatever happened, but it only averages and only pays attention, focuses on the peaks and the ending part of whatever that event was. So, for example, there are different studies conducted, and let's say there was a study, but I'm just gonna use my own example. It didn't necessarily happen. I don't know if there were any studies, but it's just like to give you an example. There is let's say there was a medical treatment, and that medical treatment was painful, and it lasted for 10 minutes. Okay, 10 minutes of painful medical treatment. It could be like at the dentist, for example, and they also did on the same patient a medical treatment that had 10-minute long painful part, but last 5 minutes were not painful, were not that painful, but they were kind of like not very pleasant. It did cause some discomfort, but the first one was 10-minute painful, second one had the same 10-minute long painful part, but the last 5 minutes were not that painful. So 10 and 15. And patients chose the 15-minute long treatment instead of 10. Obviously, they didn't know the lengths, they didn't know it. They just were performed these treatments without them seeing the time. So the reason why they chose the 15-minute long one, although the 10-minute one long is better for them, is because their narrating self takes charge in such situations, because our experiencing self does not have a say in it, because our experiencing self definitely knows that it would have been better to choose 10-minute long medical treatment, but we chose 15-minute long because the last 5 minutes were sort of less painful. And Yuval Noah Harari also brings an example of kids going to their pediatricians because there they can get some sweets at the end of the checkup, and their unpleasant experience at the clinic ends up with something pleasant, and then the next time they don't really refuse to go there. Sorry, I switched on the light because it was getting too dark and the whole video quality was getting sort of weird. So so narrating self, quote, "It doesn't narrate everything and usually weaves the story using only peak moments and end results. The value of the whole experience is determined by averaging peaks with ends," end quote. Now, here's important part. Quote, "Indeed, from the viewpoint of the narrating self, the doctor would add a few completely superfluous minutes of dull aches at the very end of the test because it would make the entire memory far less traumatic." End quote. And I also liked how he wrote here, quote, "The experiencing self remembers nothing. It tells no stories and is seldom consulted when it comes to major decisions. Retrieving memories, telling stories, and making big decisions are all the monopoly of a very different entity inside us, narrating self." End quote. And now I find this super interesting because this is actually the answer to my question, because I experienced a horrible pain during childbirth that I do not ever want to go through again, ever. But that self, my experiencing self, does not have a say. It just does not have a say. It doesn't have any memories. It did experience it, but it has no power to make any decisions. Now, my narrating self, it just makes me, so I remember only the peaks, the horror, but also the end result, obviously my baby. And I love him to the moon and back, and obviously I'm super excited to have my baby. It's absolutely, unimaginable happiness, and I'm very happy. So that's the end result, and that's how I want that again. I want to have that feelings again, and I want to have a baby again, and that's why I decided to have my second child. Although I am terrified, but my experiencing self that is terrified, but it doesn't have a say here. And I love how he wrote here, quote, "Evolution discovered this trick eons before the pediatricians." Now, eons, I didn't know what that was, but it means long, long, long time ago. "Given the unbearable torments that many women undergo during childbirth, one might think that after going through it once, no sane woman would ever agree to do so again. However, at the end of labor and in the following days, the hormonal system secretes cortisol and beta endorphins, which reduce the pain and create a feeling of relief and sometimes even of elation. Moreover, the growing love towards the baby and the acclaim from friends, family members, religious dogmas, nationalist propaganda conspire to transform childbirth from a terrible trauma into a positive memory." End quote. How interesting. I'm just absolutely amazed by this whole explanation, because now this completely answered my question, and I am very thankful that I didn't really have to go through lots of literature and scientific papers to get an answer to this question. It's all here, and I'll put in the description below the pages if you're interested, because there are more detailed studies that are given here, or obviously you can do your own research about narrating self and experiencing self. I really find the whole topic fascinating, because we have two selves that we don't really know about. There's an experiencing self and there's a narrating self, and one of them has no power in making decisions, whereas although it goes through all the pain, and then the other one lets us only to remember the good stuff and just pays attention to the peaks, and then only to what happens at the end. So I really am super fascinated about this topic. Let me know what you think. Did you know this already, maybe instinctively, or maybe you already knew, maybe you read about it somewhere? What are your thoughts? And have you also decided to have your second or third child? And what were your thoughts? Were you also curious as to why are you not so terrified? Why were you not so worried? And I'm sure you were worried. I mean, everyone's worried, but how come you decided to have your second child, and then although you knew what a terrible pain it is, and were you also curious why you made that decision? Yeah, so let me know. I'm super curious, and I hope this was informative and this may give you some idea about how our selves do play a role in our decision making, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.